And my midwife assistant said, go ahead, feel for your baby. And I was crying. I said, no, I can't. Again, I couldn't believe how exhausted I was personally. She said, okay, well, sit back. And next thing I know, I sit back and she's handing me my baby and placing her on my chest.
Mhm.
And I just cried. And looking back, and there's a video of it and there's pictures. Looking back, that cry was just so many things. It was, first of all, happiness that it was over and that I was through the most difficult part. It was immense relief and joy that my daughter was here and she was safe. And it was also, it was my redemptive birth. And I did it. And it was just, those tears were just, and obviously it makes me emotional now, but
Yeah.
I I did it and I was able to heal all that trauma that I experienced and
Mhm.
the love and support that was in the room. It was palpable and wow.
Hey, you're listening to Empowered Births at Home with me, Esmeralda, the home birth doula, as your host. I am a mama of three, fellow home birther, and entrepreneur. I am completely obsessed with birth, more specifically, home birth. And this is a podcast where women share their empowering home birth stories, along with the journey that led them down the path to home birth. Whether you're currently pregnant, planning a home birth with your first or fourth baby, or even just someone who is a complete birth nerd like me, this is the podcast for you. So let's get into this week's empowering home birth story. We are on episode 35 today. We will be talking with Chelsea, and she will share with us her home birth after cesarean story and a little bit about her first birth as well, which was traumatic. So make sure that you are holding space for her while she shares that story with us. Let's go ahead and bring Chelsea on.
My name is Chelsea. I live in the greater Philadelphia area. My husband and I have been married for 6 years now, and we have two little girls, both of which I'll share their birth stories. And yeah, that's, a little just about me. I work full time, and my husband is home full time with the girls, which I think is another important piece for my experience. And
Mm.
that's me.
Yeah, awesome. And so, how did the idea of home birth come into your mind?
So I have a sister who's 6 years older than me. She had my first nephew in a birthing center when she was living in Texas. And then she moved to Pennsylvania. And for her second birth, she was unable to have her second at a birth center. So she chose to do a home birth. So I always knew about it. However, I have a heart condition, and because of that, it just made me a little bit nervous. My sister tried to push me to say, hey, home birth is a really great option. You should look into it. Unfortunately, I did not do that before having my first. So I did have a hospital birth with her. But after I had my hospital birth, unfortunately, it was a more traumatic experience for me. And from the moment that she was born, it kind of planted that seed to say, I want this to be different the next time I experience it. And I really started spending a lot of time and energy trying to heal that experience for my first labor and delivery and prepare if my husband and I ended up choosing to have a second, which we obviously did. Preparing myself to make sure that I had a better experience.
Mm, okay. Yeah, that's definitely understandable. Do you want to share a little bit about your first birth experience?
Sure. So I got pregnant with my daughter. She was born in January 2021. So it was in the middle of COVID time period. And I just went the normal route. I had gotten some recommendations from friends, and I chose a midwife that was within an OB's group at a local hospital. And I went through, typical appointments with her. I knew that I would have liked to have a unmedicated birth if possible, and no complications throughout my pregnancy or anything like that. It all went pretty smoothly. There were some times in hindsight that I felt as though my intuition was telling me I didn't have the best connection with that midwife in the group, but I ignored that, even though I continued to have that experience on multiple appointments. But I told myself it was fine and I was overreacting.
Mm-hmm.
And I went into, well, actually, before I say I went into labor, so I went in for my appointment right when I was around 39 weeks, and the midwife was already suggesting that we schedule an induction date because she was going on vacation soon. And that
Oh.
should have been another red flag for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I said, you know what, let's do a membrane sweep. I really wanted to go into labor naturally and have an unmedicated birth. So I did a membrane sweep and I ended up going into labor with my first at exactly 40 weeks.
Mm-hmm.
Labored at home, went into the hospital. Once I got there, I was 4 centimeters dilated, and I was, it was difficult for me. I mean, I really felt like I handled the beginning well, but as I approached transition, that's when I ended up getting an epidural. And from there, it was what people would call the typical cascade of interventions. And while I was pushing, my daughter's heart rate decreased and they rushed me off to the OR for an emergency C-section.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my experience with my first. And then, as I said, after that, I knew that the second time around, I needed it to be different. And I also needed
Yeah.
to heal myself from that experience. It breaks my heart that I knew intuitively that there were things that were trying to call out to me and saying, this is not the path that you want to take. This is not the experience you want. And rather than explore that and listen to myself, I really tampered that voice down and continued on a path that wasn't the best choice for me.
Yeah, definitely. I feel like in today's society, even though there's so much like female empowerment and like the feminist movement of being for the female, it's not very like common for women to be told to follow their intuition. Like that's something that's not included in women empowerment. It's like be a boss babe, go work, go do this. Like that's where women are empowered right now in society, but it's not where it's like you need to follow your intuition, your gut, like follow what your instincts are telling you. We're not told that. And so it's very hard for a lot of us to actually listen to what we're like telling ourselves, what we can feel is not right. And it's just, I think, especially if it's kind of going against the norm of what we're told is what's supposed to happen, we will just tell ourselves, like, oh no, like I can't listen to what's telling me is wrong because everybody else is telling me that that's right. So I must be wrong. And
Exactly.
yeah, so I feel like it's really hard for us to find that ability to listen to our intuition. And it's so sad that we're not taught that, like, we know a lot of what we need. If we just
Mhm.
listen and like dig deep, we can find exactly our own decisions within ourselves.
100%. And I've thankfully been blessed enough to develop that as being a
Hmm.
mom of two at this point. But it's certainly sad to look back and know that that's what I was telling myself and I ignored it.
Hmm.
But at the same time, it's allowed me to get to where I am today. So there's a
Yeah.
part of me that I'm grateful I went through that process because I don't think I would be where I'm at today with that growth that I've had from an individual perspective.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And so when you got pregnant with your second, what was that journey like to going towards a home birth?
So before we even got pregnant with our second, I laid out the options for myself, right? It's hospital, a home birth, or a birthing center. And for me, a birthing center just I knew was not a good fit. If I'm in a birthing center, I might as well be in a hospital, is how I felt
Hmm.
about it. I'm very much a homebody. That's my place of comfort. So birth center was off the list right away. And it was really evaluating whether or not I felt like home birth was right for me. And I did a lot of research. I did a lot of podcasts and I just
Hmm.
listened to other women's stories and kind of kicking back to listening to your own intuition. I really paid a lot of attention to how I felt hearing other people's stories. And when I would listen to a story, why did I feel certain emotions, and started processing those emotions with my husband and having those discussions as well. So even before we got pregnant, I told my husband I wanted a home birth, and he said he was supportive of it because he trusted the research that I had done, and he trusted that I knew what was right for me. So I'm very type A. And I actually interviewed my midwives and doulas before I even got pregnant. I wanted
Okay.
to be prepared that I knew who my providers were so that the moment I got pregnant, I could say, "Hey, I'm pregnant. Put me on your list. This is this is when I'm due." And so when I got pregnant, I had already made those choices, and we were full on moving towards a home birth.
hmm Yeah, that's amazing. I actually credit women who do things before being pregnant. It's like something that I think most women don't think about doing, like finding providers, doing research, doing all of that until it actually happens and they're in the moment, then usually they'll do it. So for all the women who do it beforehand, I really give them like big props because that's honestly the best way to do it, especially in today where it's so hard to find a provider that will actually go with all of your choices and do everything the way that you're wanting your birth to go. And so if you're kind of putting yourself on a time crunch of already being pregnant and trying to find somebody, especially if you're doing it maybe in the second trimester, there's going to be midwives who are going to be booked already. And so it's going to be harder for you to find that like perfect fit midwife because maybe it would have been that midwife who's already booked out. So it's really a big benefit of just your own birth to be able to do all that beforehand.
Well, the irony of the situation is that I went through both those experiences where I had
Mm,
interviewed midwives, chosen a midwife. I had chosen a doula as well. And I started with that first midwife, and unfortunately, it just wasn't a good fit. And there was a
mm,
situation in which I had reached out on a weekend because I was having some UTI symptoms. And the response that I got immediately took me back.
mm,
And I said, I don't think I can ignore this. I couldn't ignore my intuition and my first response saying, this feels off.
mhm,
And I told myself, I could choose to ignore this again, right? Like I did the first time. Or I could say, this could influence the home birth that I'm dreaming of. And I need to
mhm,
make sure that I'm with someone that I trust and I'm comfortable with. And so I again spoke to my husband and I said, I can't continue to work with her. I don't trust her. And I don't want to have any sort of emotional block during
mhm,
my labor. So I was 20 weeks at that point.
mm,
I started looking for other midwives. And again, I had already done so much research, so I knew what midwives to contact. But unfortunately, a lot of those midwives were booked. So
mhm,
every time I'd reach out to one midwife, she'd say, "Oh, well, you're out of my area. Reach out to this midwife." Or, "Oh, I'm booked. Reach out to this midwife." So
mhm,
I was grateful that they had all recommended other individuals, but it was down to the wire, and I was feeling really stressed about what options I was going to have. And luck of the draw, I there was someone who I thought I was out of her area, and I was not. And I got in
mm,
touch with her, and I spoke to her, and I remember as soon as I got on the phone with her, she said, "What's going on?" And I said, I might cry. And she goes, "Okay, go ahead and cry if that's what you need." And it felt like someone who didn't even know me, didn't know my story, was giving me so much space and respect to
mhm,
feel what I needed to feel. And we had a great conversation. She said she would send me more information. And I went home that night and I said, okay, I found our midwife. And so I switched providers at 20 weeks, and I could not be more grateful that I did. I have goosebumps even thinking about it and speaking
mhm,
about it, because the fit that I had with my second midwife was everything that I knew that I wanted and needed for my home birth.
mm. Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, there is irony in how usually you can like do all of this prep and find the people who you think you're going to connect with the most, but when it comes down to it, sometimes there are things that don't really match what you're looking for. And it is best to have somebody who kind of is, like I said, that perfect fit for you. Because if you're butting heads on anything, or if you're disagreeing about something, it could affect the way that your birth experience goes. And that's absolutely not something, obviously, that we would want to happen during your birth.
Exactly. Yes.
Hmm. Yeah, that's awesome that you were able to like find that right provider right before.
Yes. Exactly.
And so, how did the prep kind of go during that pregnancy for a home birth? What were like different things that you did leading up to this birth compared to your first birth in the hospital?
It's funny, there were a lot of things I said I was going to do that I did not do.
Mm,
I said I was going to work out and be consistent and all these other things to prepare my body from a physical perspective, but I did not feel well. I was
mhm.
knocked up until 24 weeks and then it went away just for a few weeks and then came back again. So that was really rough for me. I'm not one that enjoys being pregnant. So I moved my body when I could. Again, I had a toddler at the time. She was 2.5 when I was pregnant.
Mm,
So we do a lot of walks around the neighborhood. So that was my way of keeping my body moving. And I just tried to do the best I could in regards to my nutrition. So working around my food aversions and whatever nausea I had, but just trying to do the best. From a mental and emotional health perspective, I got in contact through my midwife to a therapist who specializes and works with pregnancies, postpartums, things like that, and I ended up doing a call with her. I think that was like an hour and a half long, which was really great. It was an opportunity for me to have even more of a chance to process what had happened the first time
yeah.
and prepare myself for going through that process again, but at home. So that was huge for me. It made me feel really confident in where I was at. And then I would say the bulk of my preparation for home birth was listening to podcasts. And if
Mm,
there was a particular topic that I was concerned about, or I didn't know enough about, or I wasn't sure what my decision would be, I would search for that podcast title. There was a couple different podcasts I listened to, including yours, of course. And
mhm.
I would listen to those stories and it just gave me a lot of clarity and confidence in what I was doing. So we didn't do any birth courses this time. I didn't feel the need to, so I didn't
Mhm.
want to add that added stress onto it. And again, I will just credit all of the wonderful podcasts that are out there to talk about informed consent and home birth and just giving women the opportunity to share their stories. It was really empowering.
Yeah, absolutely. The first part that you said about like the physical preparation, I feel like a lot of women will dwell on that, especially at the very beginning. Like, I need to work out, I need to do this, I need to stay in shape, or I need to just having this image in their head of constantly having that like physical aspect of either weight training or doing something the whole time. And it's like some people, yeah, that works out and it does benefit them to keep going with it. But for some, especially if you have kids beforehand, or maybe if you're someone who's not used to doing all of that, you're not a person who usually works out, it's hard to keep up with that and be pregnant. So definitely walking is something that I think every woman can do, especially if you have kids. They love going on walks. So that's something I love to do too even without being pregnant, but with being pregnant, it is helpful to just be up and moving at some point during the day. So just going on simple walks is really the easiest way to get that going. So,
Exactly. And it helps, I think, with the mental aspect of it too, depending on where you are and what time of year. But it was nice to just get outside. That fresh air always helps me clear my mind a little bit. And
mhm.
it also gave me a little more patience with my toddler because being pregnant with a
Yes.
toddler is not easy.
Mhm. Yes, absolutely. And then how you said about the podcast too, I feel like that's such a big part of a lot of women's prep now with podcasts being so big is just listening to different stories and to different like educational podcasts is really beneficial. And that's why I really did want to start this podcast too, because I feel like it does help so many women to prepare just by listening to different experiences and knowing, okay, like this might happen, but also that didn't happen to this person, so it might not happen, but
Mhm.
you kind of know maybe the route to take if it does happen because they shared their experience. And it just gives so much education, and it's awesome to have this platform with so much free education because
Mhm.
podcasts we can just listen to for free. It's not something we have to go and invest a huge chunk of money in. And so, yeah, I really love podcasts and especially like the birth niche in podcasts too. It's really helpful.
Yes, agreed.
Mhm. And so going into your labor, what was that like, the very beginning of it?
So I had a really big feeling that I was going early, and I think sometimes a lot of women think that and they don't. But I kept having dreams that I was going into labor, and I just kept saying, I want to make it to 37 weeks. I want to make it to 37 weeks. So 37 weeks hit, and I was like, yes, I made it. I can have my home birth.
Mhm.
And then I knew ahead of time, even before I booked, that my doula would be out of the country from 37 plus 2 to 38 plus 2, right in that time frame.
Mm.
And then that was the next barrier that I needed to hit. I just want my doula to be back in the country. Of course, I had a backup doula and I trusted the other
Yeah.
providers that she had aligned for me. But again, you spend time creating that relationship and that bond. So it was really important for me that she was back. So at 38 plus 1, which was a Wednesday, my midwife texted me and she said, "Hey, I'm back home and I'm back on call. How are you doing?" And she checked in. And ironically enough, that morning I had woken up with contractions. Now,
Mm.
before this, I had a lot of Braxton Hicks, but when I woke up that Wednesday morning, I knew that it was something different.
Mhm.
And they were intermittent all throughout the day, no regular timing to them. I carried on with my day as per usual. And that Wednesday night, I reached out to both my doula and my midwife and explained to them, hey, this is what I'm feeling. This is what's going on. They said, all right, get as much rest as you can tonight. Hydrate, eat, sleep, and we'll chat tomorrow. Just reach out if you need anything. And so that night, it was a really emotional night for me, knowing in my soul that this was the last night with my daughter, just being an only child. And so
Mhm.
we have historically been co-sleeping with my daughter, and that night I put her to bed and she starts out by herself, and usually if she doesn't call out for us then she sleeps alone, but this night I told my husband, I said, I need to go sleep with her tonight because this is my last chance with just her. And
Mhm.
so I slept with my daughter. I had contractions all night, about 15 to 20 minutes apart. I would wake up and breathe through the contractions and then go back to sleep, which I used to hear that all the time on the podcasts and women saying they were sleeping between contractions. And I'd be like, that's not true. You're not doing that. It is, in fact, true that your body can do amazing things. So I would wake up, breathe through them, and I'd kind of look at my daughter and I'd fall right back asleep. So I did that all night. And then I woke up Thursday morning. Thursday morning is the only day of the week that my daughter goes to a daycare. And it was really important for me that she was part of the labor experience. It was
Mhm.
actually one of the influential factors about having a home birth is that I wanted her there. And so my husband and I went back and forth. I'm like, do we send her to daycare? Do we keep her home? He's like, let's send her because I can always go pick her up if need be. I said, okay, that sounds good. So we sent my daughter to daycare and my contractions remained about 15 to 20 minutes apart most of the day. And I reached out to my midwife and my doula. They recommended the Miles circuit, which I did. And that ended up slowing down my contractions and giving even more time in between.
Mm.
But what was really confusing for me is that the contractions weren't any tighter in regards to time, but
Mhm.
they were more intense. And so
Okay.
as the day progressed, I found myself having to breathe through them, having to
Mhm.
stop and allow myself to work through them. And during the day, I was timing the contractions, which that was one big thing. I'll say this now as one thing I wish I didn't do. I wish I didn't do that. I really got into my head rather than listening to my body.
Mhm.
And I should have just said, okay, this is what it is, right? And if my
Yeah.
midwife or doula needed timing, then I could have easily tracked a contraction or two and said,
Mhm.
okay, this is where I'm at. But I did it throughout the day. And then around 4:30, my husband went to pick up my daughter. And by this point, again, vocalizing through contractions and started to not necessarily have doubt, but start to question and say, how am I going to do this? My contractions are still only 15 minutes apart, but I'm having a hard time coping with them.
Mm.
And I told myself, I need to put my phone down. I'm not timing contractions. We had a beautiful thunderstorm blowing through. So I went and sat on the front porch on a rocking chair, closed my eyes, and just let my body do its thing. And so that allowed me to start breathing through the contractions again. I was no longer vocalizing. It kind of allowed me to center myself in a way.
Mhm.
And my daughter and my husband got home around 5:30. The moment that my daughter was home, my contractions were 4 minutes apart. It was that first, and I think I had two emotional barriers in my labor, and that was the first one that
Yeah.
it was so important for her to be there that my body was not willing to proceed until she was there. So the moment she
Mhm.
got home, it went from 15 minutes apart to 4 minutes apart.
Mm.
And my birthing team, they had said to me, let us know when you feel a shift. And I didn't know what that meant. What do you
Yeah.
mean by a shift? I'm like, okay, I'll let you know. And then once I experienced the shift, I knew
Mhm.
what they meant because
Yeah.
I felt it, right? It goes back to kind of trusting your body and listening to your intuition. So at that point, I had reached out to my team again, gave my doula an update. I was mostly talking to my doula at this point, and I said, I really want to do a contraction with you on the phone because that was what I heard other women doing from the podcasts.
Mhm.
And it was important for me to know, okay, am I in active labor? Am I approaching active labor? I have all this knowledge and information, but it's hard to pair it together with what I'm experiencing.
Yeah.
So I got on the phone with my doula. I went through one contraction with her, and she said, okay, I'm going to get my stuff together and I'm going to get in the car. She lived about an hour away. And I was like, okay, this is it. This is real.
Mhm.
So the game plan that we had was my husband was responsible for my daughter, and that was what I wanted him to focus on.
Mhm.
So he got her dinner. She was kind of helping me through my contractions. It was nice enough that she was there for meetings with the midwife and doula. So she had done some counter pressure for me. She was coaching me through contractions. And then probably around 6:45 or 7 o'clock, I ended up getting onto the toilet because I had heard a lot of women having relief laboring on the toilet. So got onto the toilet. My daughter was there on her little step stool. She brought me a ton of books and she made me read to her. So I sat in the bathroom, and it is a very small bathroom. It's a half bath. So it's just a
Mm.
toilet and a pedestal sink. My daughter is sitting there. She would hand me a book. I would read to her. When I would have a contraction, I would give the book back to her. Now she's 3.5 at this point. She knew well enough that when I handed the book back, she would hold it. I would go through a contraction. Then she would give it back to me, and I'd keep reading after the contraction. So it was very distracting, which was good.
Mhm.
And my doula got there at 7:30. And when I heard that doorbell ring, that was like the second emotional release for me.
Mm.
As soon as she was there, I was like, okay, I can do this. This is it. So she came
Mhm.
downstairs and kneeled beside me. And shortly thereafter, I was in that labor land that women speak about. And I told her, I said, I need to get off the toilet, but I'm afraid to move. I don't
Mhm.
want to move. And she said, she's like, okay, well, your husband's getting the pool ready for you. It's a little hot. He needs to put in some cold water. By this point, I was begging her. I was like, please let me get in the birthing pool, please. She's like, well, let's move over to the couch. So by this point, I couldn't even get across the room from the bathroom to the couch without having contractions. Finally got onto the couch on my knees and had my hands draping over the back of the couch. And I told her, I said, put something under me because I'm leaking. So my water broke at that point. And at least I had the wherewithal in my head. I did not want to ruin my couch.
Yeah.
So I said, put something under me. And then shortly thereafter, they were able to help me get into the birthing pool, which I thought for sure there was no way I was lifting my leg up and over that pool because those pools are a lot higher than you anticipate.
Hmm.
And the moment that I got onto that couch before they helped me into the pool, my eyes were closed and they were closed for the rest of my labor. I had no idea who was where. I didn't really know that my husband and my daughter were there, although I got to see a lot of beautiful pictures afterward and they were right there with me.
Hmm.
And I my body started pushing as soon as I got into the pool. And again, it's funny to go through the experience after hearing so many podcast stories of women saying their body started pushing and they
Hmm.
weren't pushing. And I heard one person say it's very much like the reflex when you're vomiting of
Hmm.
once it happens, you can't control it.
Yeah.
And that's exactly what I experienced. And I was in the pool, my body started pushing. I initially started hands and knees, but then at some point had gone into like a reclined position, like I was sitting with my back against the pool and reclined a bit. And every contraction, I would slide flatter and flatter and flatter. I had zero energy to hold myself up.
Hmm.
And I knew my midwife was on the way. And my doula at some point was like, I think you should change positions because I was reaching down because I knew that a lot of women said if they felt their baby's head, it was very encouraging for them. So
Hmm.
every contraction, every push, I was, reaching down and feeling to see if I could feel anything. And it's all makes me laugh now in hindsight. I would whisper in between contractions and it's I don't think it's working. It's not working. And my midwife or my doula, excuse me, said, I think we should change positions. But there was no way I was moving. Even when I first got into the pool, I still had my underwear on. And I made my husband and my doula cut it off because I was not in a place that I could take my underwear off by myself. So
Hmm.
there was no way I wanted to move and change positions. And I labored like that until my midwife got there. It was my midwife and her assistant. And I heard them come into the room and I hear the assistant go, so what's going on here? And I knew it was because I was not in a great position. My husband laughs and says I was drowning at this point because my head is like bobbing in and out of the water, but I was so exhausted. And the assistant came over and she's like, you're gonna flip over. We're gonna get on your hands and knees. And she kind of grabbed my leg and started to move me, which in the moment in my head, I was like, I am going to kill you. What are you doing? This is not okay. And she flipped me over, got on hands and knees. And the moment I did that, my daughter was there. Like I felt her head,
Yeah.
ring of fire, and all of it. So I joke around that I wanted to kill her for doing that, but I'm
Hmm.
so very grateful that she did because it's exactly what I needed.
Hmm.
And I pushed on that hands and knees position. And my midwife assistant said, go ahead, feel for your baby. And I was crying. I said, no, no, I can't. Again, I couldn't believe how exhausted I was personally. And she said, okay, well, sit back. And next thing I know, I sit back and she's handing me my baby and placing her on my chest.
Hmm.
And I just cried. And looking back, and there's a video of it and there's pictures. Looking back, that cry was just so many things. It was, first of all, happiness that it was over and that I was through the most difficult part. It was immense relief and joy that my daughter was here and she was safe. And it was my redemptive birth. And I did it. And it was just, those tears were just, and obviously it makes me emotional now, but
Yeah.
I, I did it and I was able to heal all that trauma that I experienced and
Hmm.
the love and support that was in the room. It was palpable. And wow, like I'm sure your experiences and everyone else that you speak to, but what an absolutely beautiful moment to have and to share that with my husband and my toddler and then my newborn baby. It was everything.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. You almost brought me to tears with that. I'm like over here getting teary-eyed. Oh, that was so great. Oh, I loved it. The very beginning, how you said that you kind of spent all day tracking your contractions and just like doing that and focusing on that. I did that too with my first home birth, and I do feel like it was such a huge part that was kind of not needed. Like I should
Mhm.
have just recorded like a few and then been like, okay, put that away. But I did feel like I needed to record every single one to know when they were getting closer. And it's such a mind game, and you don't think that tracking like the contractions will go into your mindset of like either just hindering you from progressing or making you focus on something and worrying about you not progressing. And it's just something that you don't really need to be focusing on. You could
Mhm.
always have like your partner track them, just like teach them how to catch you starting a contraction and then tell them like they could push the button. It's just a little button that you push. So you don't really have to be the one doing it. Your partner could do it. Or, like I said, you could just do it for one or two, three contractions and then stop and go back to it later on. You don't have to do it the entire labor. So I do hear that a lot of women saying that like they tracked it the whole time and they're like, I didn't really need to do that. It didn't help anything. It didn't really do anything for me. So really, it's not necessary to do that the whole labor, which is really a good point to say.
I wish
And
I had communicated that to my husband. So then
mhm,
a lot of times he's my sounding board. So then he would have been able to see me doing it and been like,
mhm,
Chelsea, put your phone away. Just enjoy
yeah.
what part of this process you can, right?
Hmm.
Let's do something else. So that was one thing that I would definitely recommend for listeners that are having their first or second or whatever it may be. Just you don't need to have your phone out recording every single one.
Hmm. And I think it's something that we kind of unintentionally do too, especially for women who are used to the hospital system or have had a hospital birth, is like everything is being tracked and recorded during a hospital birth. So we kind of bring some of that into the home birth too, where it's like, oh, well, this is what I'm supposed to do. Like, I
Hmm.
need to know what my contractions are, how long they are, how far apart they are, in order to know, like, what stage of labor I'm in order to know like this. It's almost like the cervical dilation, like
Hmm.
people who say you need one every hour to know where you're at in labor. Really, it's not going to tell you anything like it's not a crystal ball that's going to just tell you you're at this stage in labor. You have this many hours until baby's here. Your contractions and your cervical dilation are not going to tell you when baby will be here.
Yeah.
So it's not something that you really are like, oh, I have to track this one. I have to track this one too. Just don't even worry about it like that.
Exactly. Yes.
And then I really loved how you had said that you sent your daughter off and it was like going nowhere. The labor was not progressing until she got home. And that's when like everything started, which is really interesting because I hear a lot of women say that that similar thing happens, but with their midwife because they
Mm.
really don't want their midwife to miss it or they don't want a free birth like that wasn't in their plan. So their labor doesn't progress until their midwife comes in, and then that's when everything will start progressing from there. And so it's really interesting to hear that that happened with your daughter because you really wanted her there. So I really love
Yeah.
that part.
Yeah.
That's amazing. And so for the postpartum experience, how did that go?
A world of difference. Obviously, I'm comparing a vaginal delivery to a cesarean, which in and of itself is very different.
Mhm.
But being able to be home and in our environment, the first thing that I noticed right off the bat was the way in which I was able to handle my nutrition. If you
Mhm.
talk about the food that they provide in hospitals compared to me being home and my husband, again, credit to him because my midwife said, we do not want her out of bed. We want her
Mhm.
upstairs for a week. that was the goal. And they wanted
Yeah.
me in bed for as many days as possible. And we really took that to heart and prepared as much as possible. So we had a lot of, even though my daughter was born in August, it was in the middle of summer. I did not think I would want crock pot meals or stews or stuff like that. But
Yeah.
that's what's easiest. So that's what we did. And it was amazing. So the
Hmm.
nutritional support that I got being home and
Yeah.
having homemade meals and just, you know, things that were fresh and warm and that was a huge difference for me right off the bat. And then the warmth of being home and your team being there. So after labor, the way that they just take care of you, right?
Yeah.
And having there's so much less stress. And I think we don't always acknowledge how much stress can influence our bodies in regards to a healing process.
Yeah.
And so being that much less stressed and being so comfortable in my own space, I think it really just set me off on the right foot for what my healing process would be, both physically and mentally. And with my first, once we were home, I cried every single night around 5 o'clock. I would just start crying. My husband would say, "What's wrong?" And some nights there was a reason, right? It's hard. You're not sleeping. It's stressful. But there was a lot of other times where I was like, I don't know why I'm crying. I'm just crying.
Hmm.
And this time, there was none of that. I had a lot of postpartum anxiety with my first. Now, granted, that didn't start until around 4 months when I had to go back to work. So, keeping an eye on that because my daughter's almost 3 months old now. But the healing process, being home, I didn't feel any of those baby blues that I really felt the first time.
Yeah.
And I was excited to welcome my team back. I was excited for my midwife and doula to come back. And it just, I was just really happy. And
Hmm.
it was a complete 180 from what I had experienced the first time.
Yeah. That's amazing to hear that you had such a good postpartum period this time. That's something a lot of women don't understand with like all of the interventions in the hospital and medication that they give you with like Pitocin or the epidural. Your chances of getting postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety, everything like that, are all heightened because of those medications. And they really don't tell you that in the hospital. They just tell you, like, here, this will help make your labor faster, or this will help the pain. And they give you all of the pros, but none of the cons. And so there's
Mhm.
so many women who go through postpartum with postpartum depression or with just the postpartum anxiety that's going through, and they're wondering why they're going through it so much. And it's most likely because of all of the medications that were given during birth in the hospital. So I feel like I've heard a lot of women who then go on to have a home birth don't experience any of that because they didn't have any medications during their birth this time. And so they just didn't have any postpartum depression or any postpartum anxiety. And it's just, like you said, so different from the hospital birth postpartum to the home birth postpartum.
Not to mention the interruptions too. We were able to
Hmm.
control our environment after birth. So
Yeah.
we chose who was there for our birth, right? And we chose who was welcome in our home after our birth. And it really allowed us to protect that bubble we were in and
Hmm.
have that experience as a family. And when you're in the hospital, you have nurses and doctors and everyone coming in so frequently knocking on the door. And that was one of the things that was probably the number one thing that my husband was happy about in regards to
Yeah.
a home birth. He's like, I never want to go through that again because we got zero family time. We didn't get to experience this. We didn't get to rest. We were on someone else's time
Yeah.
rather than having the opportunity to enjoy that. And that's the other great thing about the home birth was that it gave us the opportunity to have our own little bubble, protect that as long as we want it to, and choose when we had visitors and when people came in. And so I think it allowed all of us to adjust to a family of four better than we would have had we had a hospital birth.
Yeah. Absolutely. Is there anything else that you feel like you would like to touch on even if it's just like a little snippet of advice for anyone listening.
I think, and we talked about this before, and it's easy for someone who's experienced it and gone through it to say tap into your intuition, but just practice tapping into your intuition. It's not an overnight thing in which you can, we're influenced by a lot of external factors, and it's not something that
Mhm.
you can just snap your fingers and say, okay, I'm going to listen to my intuition now, and I'm in touch with myself. But I think
Mhm.
that made a huge difference for me. And figure out what you want and what you need, because I don't just mean that from a perspective of, do you want a home birth or do you want a hospital birth, or do you want a water birth or do you not want a water birth? I mean that from every single choice that you make. So for me, I hear a lot of people say they didn't want to talk about that they were having home birth because they didn't want other people's negative influences. For me, it was really important to talk about it because I wanted other
Mhm.
people to know that this is a normal choice, that this is an option. And
Mhm.
so every choice that I made throughout my pregnancy and my labor and delivery and my postpartum period was really driven by me listening to my intuition and saying, what do I want and need? And it's not
Mhm.
always easy. And it's something that I'm still practicing myself. But I think that with where I'm at and looking back at my story and my experience, I'm so grateful that I got there. And I got there by practicing. And it's kind of like a muscle. You have to work it out, right? And you
Mhm.
have to continue to work at it. And that allowed me to get to where I'm at. So that is the main key takeaway that I had. The other funny takeaway that I will say is, if you're home and having a home birth, maybe you should tell your husband where everything is in preparation for the home birth. I did not do so. And my daughter, rather than being wrapped in the really beautiful brand new receiving blanket that I got, she was wrapped in a kitchen towel. It was clean, but it was a old, raggedy looking kitchen towel that my daughter was wrapped in. And those are the pictures that we have now of that. So kind of two key takeaways, one serious
Mhm.
and one kind of funny. Make sure your husband knows where everything is that you want available, because you will not be in the mindset to tell him where to go.
Mhm. Yeah, absolutely. It's really funny that you say that because a lot of women will be surprised when I tell them to create a birth plan and like write down everything that they want for their birth. And they kind of look at me like, well, like, what if it doesn't happen like that? Like, I can't plan it to a T. And I'm like, yeah, I know birth will happen the way it happens, and we can't plan every single part of it. But for instance, things like that, where it's something you in your mind really want to happen, and it's something that somebody else can make sure happens for you,
Mm-hmm.
then it will most likely happen. Because if you're in here picturing there's going to be those affirmation cards and twinkly lights on, and you want a camera to be set up, but you're in labor and you can't set any of this stuff up, if somebody else knows, they'll be able to go do all those things for you. And then your birth will be how you wanted it to be, how you pictured it, how you imagined. And so that's why I really do tell women, like, write it down exactly how you want it. If there's like certain things that you want at your birth or something specific that you need there or want there, write it down and let your birth team know, let your partner know, let your doula know, and then they can do all of that for you. So,
I
yeah.
agree completely. And even the little details, like you were
Hmm.
mentioning, and the receiving blanket, whatever it may be, because once I was in that labor land, I was having normal thoughts in my head and
Hmm.
conversations with myself. I could not express any of it. So I couldn't have
Yeah.
any conversation. Even at one point, I felt like I had to vomit. And I said that. And I have vomit bags specifically for that reason. My husband didn't know where they are. So in my
Yeah.
head, I'm like, they're in the top cabinet in the kitchen above the cups. Well, there was no way that I was communicating that. So I agree with that. Have your things prepared, maybe have it in your birth space early, and also having things written down so other people can assist you with what you want done.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for sharing everything that you shared with us today. It was really beautiful hearing your birth story. And if you want anyone to kind of connect with you, is there anywhere we can send them to do that?
I should send you the link. After my first, I started writing a blog about the fourth trimester, which
Okay.
I have a couple of really great posts that I'm proud of that I think a lot of women would relate to. So
Mhm.
it's called the fourth trimester. I will send you the link as well.
Okay.
Maybe, I don't know if we can link it or
Yeah.
anything like that. But I'll send it to you because I think that's a really great resource. That was a way for me to process my trauma from my first experience. And I would really love to get back to writing again. So any support that I get on that would be wonderful.
Yeah, absolutely. I could link that in the show notes so anyone who's interested can just find it there really easily.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much.
What a beautiful HBAC story Chelsea shared with us today. I know I've said this before, but I am just so grateful to the women who come on and share their birth experiences with us, especially when one of their births or a couple of their births have been a traumatic experience, and them being willing to share all of that information and those stories with us is just so amazing, and it can be so impactful for other women to hear those stories. And it can be such a great reminder to women that that doesn't have to be the end of your birth stories. You can go on to have an amazing and empowering home birth after experiencing even a traumatic birth before. So, again, thank you so much to all the women who come on and are willing to share their stories with all of us. If you are someone who wants to come on the podcast and share your own home birth story with us all, I do have a new submission form where you can go and submit your story, and then I will reach out to you and we can go ahead and get an interview scheduled to get you on the podcast. If you are someone who's interested in that, the link is down below for the submission form. So make sure you go ahead and fill that out, and maybe you'll be on the podcast next year in 2025. If you are currently planning and preparing for a home birth, then I'd love to share with you more information about the Empowered Home Birth course. This is a home birth based birth course, and inside this 8-week program, you will receive educational videos and weekly emails filled with additional resources for you to prepare for your empowering home birth. Once you purchase the course, you also get perks such as access to my entire resource library and private community chats. To enroll, click the link in the show notes and get started on the journey to your empowered home birth. Thank you so much for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love for you to share with any family or friends who may benefit from these empowering stories. Also, don't forget to leave a 5-star rating and review to help others who are searching for this information find this podcast. I'll see you next week for another empowering home birth story.